So good morning to all of you in Leuven, goedemorgen, and good afternoon to those who are in the Philippines. My name is Malu Ibita. I teach in both Leuven and here in the Philippines. And so I would like to welcome you once again in this presentation that is part of the Leuven, Ateneo de Manila, and De La Salle University Global Minds Open Faculty project entitled Well-Being, Inclusivity, and Sustainability, Exchanges Between North and South. Professor Biedinger is a member of this project, as well as the other faculty members that we have here, like Dr. Ibita, my sister, and our speaker for today. Our guest from the Philippines today is a graduate of the Loyola School of Theology, and her research interests include feminist theory and contextual theology, and she teaches at the graduate school and the undergraduate classes of the Ateneo de Manila University. I would like to welcome in this gathering today our speaker, Dr. Rachel Joyce Marie Sanchez, who will speak to us about companionship with the earth as a new but really old paradigm for authentic development. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Sanchez. Dr. Sanchez, you have the floor.
Hi, good morning, everyone in Leuven, and good afternoon to those in the Philippines. So we have some reminders before we start. You've seen this, for those who came in early, you've seen this slide already. This session will be recorded. Print shots will be taken for documentation. Some parts or the recording will be posted on the CWST Facebook page. And then we'd like to remind you to change your Zoom name to your name, institutional affiliation. So hi again, I'm Rachel Joyce Marie O. Sanchez. It's quite a long name, so I ask people to just call me Ray. And before we start, I'd like to tell you a bit more about myself. So I'm a Filipina. I was born here and I've been staying here ever since I was born. Okay, my research interest, as mentioned, is feminist theology, but eventually I also got into post-colonial framework. So in the Philippines, some scholars question whether feminism is something that we can really use or whether it's something that is foreign. Hence, post-colonial theory has helped grapple with that question. We also face the issue of nationalism. So we can be familiar with the oppressive kind of nationalism, and that can be true. But it's also still something that we are struggling with as a nation. An author even called the Philippines as a nation aborted. We started as tribes and then we were colonized. And until now, we are still trying to define what nation means. I've been to Europe once, thanks to Leuven, the Global Minds. That's when I met your prof. He toured us around Leuven. There were a lot of things that were mind-blowing for me, but one of the most fascinating things I've encountered while being in Europe was the trains. So this was before the pandemic, and we just rode the trains to go to different places, but even different countries. In my country, that's not possible. Okay, we're an archipelago, so you have to ride the boat to go to one place to another. I live in a country with rich biodiversity and beautiful beaches, but it's also the country that's hit by typhoons very often. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Right now, we are experiencing 500 years of Christianity. And that's also a contentious issue, right? So thanks to colonialism, but not so thanks to colonialism. So that's also something that we are currently reflecting about. Okay, but at the same time, another um, disclaimer, I'm a Manilena. So I'll be talking about how we can learn from indigenous culture in the Philippines, indigenous spirituality, but I cannot really claim to represent indigenous peoples. I'm a city dweller. I'm a Tagalog. Well, the Tagalogs is also uh, can be traced back to a pre-colonial tribe, but we were one of the first to assimilate into colonialism, and we are like the landers. Yes, the city dwellers. So I'm here as a co-learner with you. So I've encountered some things from indigenous culture and indigenous spirituality that can inform the way we try to understand development, the way we can try to understand how we are related to the world. It's not really a comprehensive view, and I do not claim to represent the different nuances of the different cultures that can be found in the Philippines. This is really more of to pick up some wisdom that we can gain from them. So I will be sharing some of my findings with you. Okay, so I would like to start with two stories. Okay, so the first one is something that a lot of Filipinos are familiar with. This is a story about during the time of martial law under Marcos, wherein in the Cordillera area, the government wanted to build a dam. But this dam will damage the ancestral domain of the Cordillera peoples. So there was great resistance on the part of the indigenous peoples against this dam, which was called Chico Dam. And then one day, the one journalist or one reporter went to the mountains to interview the chieftain of the indigenous peoples who were resisting against the dam. And the reporter asked the chieftain, once they were on top of the mountain, seeing the view, the reporter asked, Chieftain, is everything, are all the things that we can see here your property? And then the chieftain's response was, how can you own something that lives longer than you? That chieftain is Chief Makliing Dulag of the Butbut tribe. How can you own something that lives longer than you? While everyone was talking about property, about whose right is it to own the land and to decide what should happen to it, the indigenous person, leader, saw the land with reverence, with humility, that actually our lives are passing, but this land has always been here, and this land will continue to be here, and we must respect it. So that's the first story I'd like to share with you that inspires this conversation that we are starting. The second one is a story shared to me by one of my students. So this student was in fourth year then. They went on an immersion. So during immersions before the pandemic, our students would stay around 3 days in communities. And this particular student stayed in an indigenous community. Now, one day, they walked very far. Okay, they walked very far, and this was very tiring for my student who wasn't used to walking very far and climbing the mountains. Okay, very high, and they went there to pick some fruit trees. So not the fruit tree. Okay, to pick some fruits from the trees, and then after doing so, my student noticed that there were still fruits left on the tree. So my student asked her host family, why don't we go ahead and pick more of the fruits on the trees? Why are we stopping now? Because that was counterintuitive for my student and even maybe for a lot of us. we are used to getting the most out of something. Like, they have walked so far already. Why won't they pick everything that they can pick? Or in the Philippines, we even have, I'm not sure, do you have Eat All You Can in Leuven? Eat All You Can buffet. Yeah, so here, when there's Eat All You Can buffet, you really, stuff yourself because you want to get the most out of whatever there is. But the attitude of the community was counterintuitive to that. It was also counter to the value of efficiency. Like, why take 3 trips a week on foot to pick fruits when you can do it in 1 week and gather everything? It was also counterintuitive to the notion of saving, right? We want to have something extra so that if something unexpected happens, we can still have the fruit or we can still have food. But the answer of the foster parent of my student was this: so that the next person will also have something. So that the next person who passes by can also have something. So here we see a person not only thinking about himself or herself or his family or her family, but the wider community. And there is also trust in that, right? That they are a community who care for one another. They won't try to accumulate as much as they can in order to compete with others or in order to ensure their own security. Okay, so as we go through this talk, I hope that these two stories can be more enfleshed. Like, what are the implications of these kinds of attitudes that the Indigenous people witnessed to? What can that mean for us? Okay, so we will be using Paul EV for this talk. So there are some times when I will be asking questions. I hope that people will, interact with this. The limit is up to 40 people. I don't know how many we are now. So unlike the fruits on the fruit tree, the participation is quite limited. So first come, first serve. Okay, so whoever can answer first. Okay, so here's the first question. What concerns is the Earth facing now? So maybe based on your studies or based on where you come from or your own observations or what's been flooding your social media, what concerns is the Earth currently facing now? Okay, so you could have used the QR code, or you can just simply type polyv.com/raysanchez379 to your phone or to another tab in your browser. Okay, have people responded already? Can I see a thumbs up if you've responded, just so we know where the problem lies, if ever? Okay, so we have one who has already answered. Okay, we have a few. Okay, so if it's not working, I'm sorry, can you type it on the chat instead? What concerns is the Earth currently facing now? You see another question. Okay. Sige, so instead of that, let's just use the chat. So whenever I have a question, just put it on the Zoom chat. Let's just ignore Paul EV.
Ray, Liz Herman said that they see another question. The
Yes,
question that they
yes.
see is, what can we do or what activities do you know of are in line with companionship with the earth?
Yeah, so that's a problem, but I think it will take time to fix it. So we'll just change tactics for now and just put
Okay.
your answers on the chat. So
Okay.
ignore Paul EV. Yes. Okay,
Okay.
so I can see global warming, okay, species extinction, global climate problems, wars, diseases, okay, global warming, overconsumption, uneven distribution, yes, of drinkable water, okay, seaspiracy, okay. All right. So anyway, the problems won't end. There are more which maybe some have not articulated, or maybe some already agree with what has been articulated. Okay, but it's true that these problems are not isolated cases. These are problems which the world faces as a whole. And sometimes we are not alarmed, but when we really consider these, what is happening is truly alarming. Okay, so for our agenda, this is going to be our flow. We will take a look at some a glimpse ecological crisis. We will explore companionship. We will look into some things that can add to the discussion from Asia. We will question whether we should just go back to pre-colonial times. Okay, and then we will explore some recommendations. Okay, so let's proceed. So based on what you're writing here, it's quite clear that we are facing an ecological crisis. And it is manifest, as I can see in the chat, in different forms. Okay, what do you think are causing the various ecological problems? So just put it in the chat as well. What is causing species extinction, global warming, land overuse? Okay, humans thinking we own the earth. Okay, the way we conduct our food industry, okay, and not just the food industry, various industries. Okay, the attitude of making the most out of everything can have a negative ramification. So that's expressed as YOLO, you live once. Okay, you live only once. Okay, so we seem to imbibe this attitude of wanting to take, wanting to own, feeling that the world revolves around us, to have consumerist ideologies, and to see to our own welfare rather than seeing the community as a whole. Michael Himes and Kenneth Himes, as well as other scholars, identify one mindset that is problematic, that can be at the root cause of ecological crisis, and that is anthropocentrism. And that is somehow expressed in the things you have mentioned. So when we say anthropocentrism, it's a frame of mind, and it's the way we relate with others that assumes that the human being is at the center of everything, and everything else is a tool. The value of things depends on human beings. So human beings become the basis for everything. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis qualifies what he means by anthropocentrism by using, okay, these adjectives. So we see how dangerous anthropocentrism can get. Ecofeminist theologians have this insight that actually anthropocentrism isn't just anthropocentrism, but it's also androcentrism. So anthropocentrism is wherein we see everything as though man is the center, but this man is not not a non-gendered man, but is actually a man, a male man. So when we say androcentrism, and usually they say white male man, the man becomes a standard for humanity. So the anthropos in the middle of everything is usually understood to be male. And until now, sometimes we say man for human being. So we see the gendered lens here. And you will see that the oppression against nature and the oppression against women are tied together because it's the same logic that is operating. And because of that, you will see later on that the different resources that tap indigenous wisdom, a lot of these also, at least my samples, also come from women. I mean, a lot of feminist theologians in the Philippines also recognize that they can theologize in solidarity with the indigenous peoples who are also seeking to take care of the environment or the earth. Okay, so just to connect it to Laudato Si, Pope Francis mentions the technocratic paradigm, and this can also be understood as a manifestation of the logic and of anthropocentrism, which we have, which we just talked about. So it's a paradigm that exalts the subject and then sees other things as objects to be studied, to be manipulated, to be considered as tools. Okay, so unfortunately, the way we have been conducting ourselves, as you also mentioned in the chat, is unsustainable. So if we continue with this pattern, we will end up destroying the world. And we already see manifestations of that. In the Philippines, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines wrote a pastoral letter a long time ago, 1988, but things have hardly changed. And they lament that there is destruction happening in the name of progress. So on one hand, yes, streets are being improved, infrastructure are being being put in place, but the disadvantaged continue to be the poor and continue to be the natural world. And sometimes because of these development projects, even more land is used, more deforestation happens, more people are displaced. Just to connect it to the pandemic, so this is an ongoing realization among scientists. So the names there are just examples. They mentioned that there is this reality of deep interconnectedness between human beings and the ecology, which we usually do not admit. The standard modern empirical paradigm used to see the human being as the subject, like the technocratic paradigm, used to see human beings as the subject and the rest are objects. But here, we fail to acknowledge that there is a deep interconnectedness, so that when we increase deforestation and increase urbanization, we end up diminishing biodiversity, as some of you have mentioned in the chat. And this leads to the extinction of many species, while some species that carry pathogens and human diseases that can jump on human beings are the ones that thrive and survive. Now, coupled with poverty, inequality, people are, especially in third world countries, especially in the South, are least resilient. Okay, so these factors contribute to increased risk of disease pandemics like COVID-19. Of course, it's a complex issue, right? So this is not just a linear thing, and these are not the only factors. But we can see how damage to the earth is one very important, crucial factor in the way in what is happening now. Okay, so when we say ecological crisis, we don't just speak of the manifestations, but we also see here a crisis of perspective, of values, of way of being, of a way of understanding our relationship with one another and with the earth. So the question is, how can we see our relationship with the earth differently? So before we try to look at different things we can look into, I'd like to ask you uh, if you could, reimagine the way we understand ourselves in our relationship with the earth. How would that look like? How can we see our relationship with the earth differently? So I invite you to put it on the chat again so that I can read your thoughts. So the problems are easier to answer. When it comes to rethinking things, yes, we need to think a bit more. So even just initial thoughts, it doesn't have to be a comprehensive program. Anyone?
Ray, can you please
Okay,
repeat the
so
question?
there, how can we see our relationship with the earth differently? So if it's not anthropocentric or technocratic or consumerist, right? I mean, those things that we know are problematic. How would you describe a healthier way of looking at our relationship with the earth? Okay, realization. We humans are one small component, okay, of a complex interrelated reality. Okay, so we are part of a bigger ecology, a bigger organism. Okay, a relation of interdependence. Yeah, so rather than being on top or being at the center, we see ourselves as embedded into a network. Okay, solidaristic or responsible coexistence. Okay, so we are responsible for one another. Okay, the idea of not having ownership on land, okay, a nice concept. Though we need to think, di ba, what would this mean in terms of our institutions? Okay, so Matias mentions the legal system. That's true. Okay, so hopefully the next few slides can help us keep on thinking. So let's move. And I think this next keyword, so of course this is not the only way to frame it, but this framing can be helpful. And I've chosen this because somehow this aligns with the different things you have described. Okay, so Michael Himes and Kenneth Himes, but also Elizabeth Johnson, okay, and other and the ecofeminist theologians, okay, they mention a different way of viewing things that we can name as companionship. So when we say a new paradigm, it's an overarching assumption that frames the way we see and understand the world and even pursue development. So when we say companionship, we recognize the earth as a Tao and not merely as an object to make use of. If we related this to what Thomas Berry is saying about the Ecozoic era, he's saying that we need to enter into an era of harmony, wherein we recognize that the integral function of life systems uh, is taking place in Earth, and we are mutually enhancing one another. So that's similar to the interconnectedness that you have mentioned, the solidarity, the wider solidarity that you have mentioned, the relationality that you have mentioned. Okay, and when we go to scripture, just quickly, okay, we won't really delve into this. But what this slide is saying is that in Genesis, usually the first row is the one that has been overemphasized in tradition. We're not saying that this is the only interpretation, but this has been quite the dominant interpretation for a long time. That subdue and have dominion and naming the other creatures, image and likeness of God and naming the other creatures is picked up as meaning subdue and have dominion, or as having authority with other creatures, which leads to the notion of stewardship or dominion over other created reality. So we are responsible for other created reality, but we are on top of these. We are above these because we have rationality, etc. But Himes and Himes would like to put forward an alternative interpretation, and they go back to the same scripture, but this time they pick up male and female, human beings being created as male and female, to express relationality and companionship. And they reinterpret naming other creatures as searching for a companion. When you name someone, someone is no longer a statistic. When you name the poor, that person is no longer a number or someone anonymous, but someone you know and care for. So naming connotes that, and it expresses relationality and companionship. Okay, and when we look at Elizabeth Johnson in her book Ask the Beasts, which is written to say that, hey, to understand this, we also need to consult, to ask, okay, creation, to ask the animals, to ask the beasts. And she mentions a community of creation that can be lifted out, a theme that can be lifted out from Job's, from the Psalms, from the prophets. And in her description of this community model, you can see that the things you have described in the chat are somehow also connected, okay, to what she is saying, like the keywords, reciprocal independence, our embeddedness into an interconnected system is expressed here. So we see that in the area of theology, we are trying to also see things differently to contribute to this change in mindset. Okay, so even in church teachings, we see that there is an insistence that authentic development must lead to integral improvement, not just for a few, but for everyone. And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis speaks of integral ecology. So we see the different aspects as interconnected. So we don't just try to pursue economic progress without taking into consideration the other aspects that affect the others. So that another way to probably frame the vision or the goal is beyond development would be flourishing. When we say flourishing, there is a sense of completeness. When we say this sense of completeness, it is not the kind of emptiness that we experience. Everyone always has to struggle in order to survive. But this sense of completeness is not the sense of like the Greek perfection, like a static state of completeness or Plato's perfection, but it's an ongoing pursuit that we recognize, which results from caring for ourselves, for others, for the world, and even for the spirit, even for the spiritual and the transcendent. Now, this view, this newness, this kind of new perspective, we hear people calling for this, not just in theology, but also in the secular field. And a lot of us know Greta Thunberg, who wants to wake up the grown-ups. Actually, this picture inspired this talk. This picture came from an online article by a colleague. And that colleague placed Greta Thunberg's picture along with the picture of an indigenous person from the Philippines. And that person is saying, look, these young ones and these women are calling out for this. Now, Greta Thunberg is more popular, but we have a lot of indigenous persons in the Philippines also reminding us for a long time already that we need to see the world differently and that we need to change our ways. Okay, so now we go to how this fits into the way we try to chart our course. And Felix Wilfred mentions that there is actually a lot of resources in Asia that can be listened to and that can be heard. So he writes this paragraph about Laudato Si. After praising Laudato Si for so many things, he mentions a lacuna and he says that but you know, the encyclical didn't really focus much on what we can learn from Asian traditions and religions when we could have listened to that to better respond to the anthropocentric worldview. Okay, so that is what we are trying to also do. Okay, right now, and in the more recent document from Pope Francis, he now mentions and recognizes the value of indigenous peoples and what we can learn from them. So he's saying that actually they are not opposed to progress, but they have a different notion of progress. So instead of expounding on that, I will let someone from an indigenous person try to describe what that could mean. Okay, so this video, before we start it, this video is a snippet from a documentary about an APECO project. So it's a project that's a product of government and private business partnership. Okay, so they want to develop the land on which this tribe is on. Okay, and what you will see is the conversation that happens between the president of the Philippines then, Ninoy Aquino. Pinoy, sorry, Pinoy, and the person from the tribe. Okay, so let's listen to how the person, how Vic Adumagat tries to describe what he means when he says progress.
Kung kailangan mangyari ito, hindi ho. Gusto ko lang ho magkaroon kayo ng pagkakataon. Kung ayaw nyo, bakit natin ayaw?
Tungkol po sa hanay po ng katutubo. Sa kaunlaran po ay sang-ayon kami sa kaunlaran. Yung kaunlaran po na tinutukoy mo, iba dun sa kaunlaran para sa amin. Ang kaunlaran po para sa amin ay napagyamanin po namin ang kabundukan at karagatan. Yun po ang gusto namin mangyari.
Pero sa ho, lahat ho.
Okay, so it's a longer video, but you know, there we see they're usually being blamed for being backward, being against progress, but they're actually not. But they have a different way of understanding. And usually, when we try to appreciate that, we sometimes tend to appreciate that in isolation. Like, okay, it's good for them, but it's not good for us. But I think it's about time that we listen to what they are saying, because what they are saying can also inform the way we try to do things, even in the cities or even around the globe. Okay, but unfortunately, for example, Victoria Cruz says that they have experienced this. Okay, so they have experienced in colonization. I mentioned that we are remembering 500 years of Christianity, okay, in the Philippines. That in that process, their culture has been demeaned. Their spirituality has been interpreted as paganism, and they have been victimized by the dualism that is also connected to anthropocentrism, seeing human beings at the center and the rest are objects, or androcentrism, men versus women, as she mentions here. But she says that actually there is so much to recover. There is so much in our stories, our myths, and our rituals that is there and has been looked down upon, but we need to also appreciate. So these are past events, but you see the oppression against the indigenous peoples continue. So these are, you see recent articles from 2021. These are from different tribes, and we can see violence being done against them. Even during the pandemic, the killing happens. Okay, so amidst all that, efforts to recover. So for example, among feminist theologians, a key symbol for some of them is the babaylan. So the babaylan are the ancient shamans or the pre-colonial priestesses that have been displaced in colonization. Many of these are women, but there are also some effeminate males who function as babaylans. And when they do their rituals, they dance. They serve as mediators between the spiritual and the material. They serve as bridges. So instead of seeing things in dichotomy, the they see things as interconnected. And spirituality is also very bodily for them. So I found this word from Jojo Fung. So he's not a Filipino, but he talks about Asian indigenous spirituality, and he uses the term bodiciousness to describe that kind of spirituality. I like the term bodiciousness. I don't think he intended this, but somehow this term can also sound provocative, right? It sounds very sensual. It sounds very bodily, and usually it's seen as negative. It's tempting. It's feminine. But here we see the body being recognized and being lifted up as part of the mystical experience. And what bodiciousness is saying is that this is a mystical experience that acknowledges our interconnectedness with other creatures and with the world. Okay. Another thing that we can mine in the Philippines is the key term kapwa. So when we say kapwa, it's usually translated as like serve other people. So paglingkuran ng kapwa. So kapwa is usually translated as other, but actually it's not a translation of other. Maybe it's more of fellow. But what kapwa means is we refer to other people as people sharing a shared identity with us. And that we Filipinos, when we refer to ourselves, we always refer to ourselves also in relation to others. So it somehow connotes being co-equal. And Agnes Prazal, a feminist theologian, even expands the notion of kapwa to also talk about nature. And she says that when we try to learn from the indigenous worldview, we see that even nature is kapwa. And we are part of that bigger community called to do pakikipagkapwa with nature. All these may sound like maybe, I don't know how this sounds like foreign, but this scholar, Pierre Binde, mentions that actually when we look at Christian tradition, even in the North or in the West, we can see vestiges, we can see resources that also point to a recognition of the goodness of creation. It's just not the dominant story that goes around. It's usually the Platonic or the Aristotelian way of thinking, like the hierarchy of being from Aristotle or the dualism from Plato. But that's not the only way to look at the world. And there are other resources that we can mine. And then insight here is it's not just South versus North. Like, oh, the North, they see things differently. They're all they all tend to think in dualism. They all tend to think as oppressors. And the South, they are all oppressed, but they have a very rich culture. It's not like that. Here we see that the indigenous people's cultures can serve as reminders for us to also look at our own culture, as a challenge for us to also look at our own culture and mine what is there and mine the relationality, the humility that we can find there. so that we can create a more caring community as acknowledged in this papal teachings. Okay, so almost done. Let's go to like the implications. So if if indigenous culture and wisdom and spirituality is really, it looks good, shouldn't we just go back to being pre-colonial? So what do you think? Before we proceed, just quickly, yes or no, should we go back to being pre-colonial? So you can put it on the chat, whether you think we should do that. If you have reasons, you can also share them. Okay, so no, no. Okay, so it's a resounding no. Okay, would anyone like to share why in the chat also? You might be thinking, oh, this speaker is, cheating. All the difficult questions are the ones she wants the students to answer. But I don't think it's very difficult because you have like a unanimous answer, right? No. So why do you think? Okay, world changes constantly. Why should you stand still? Okay. So like why hold on to something like a golden age that we kind of imagine in a static way? We need to have a more effective historical consciousness of what we can glean from the unfolding of history. The MOOC is a very good example. I interpret pre-colonial as also a lack of, in the end, international global communication. Okay, so in the sense that going back to pre-colonial, does that also mean that we isolate ourselves from the world? That everything that is not Filipino or not pre-colonial is bad, and we isolate ourselves from the global community. Okay, thank you. So I agree. Okay, I agree with all of you. And actually, history has already happened. How can we erase all those years? So we are not aiming for nativism, like seeing culture as perfect. Even the feminists have their own critique of the patriarchy found in their own culture. Nor we aim for environmental romanticism wherein we shun all technology and we just go back to a world before the modern era. What helps, hopefully there are many things that could help, okay? But one hermeneutic that could help is post-colonialism, which is not a nostalgic looking back at the past while we allow imperialism and hegemony to take place. We still critique these. So we say that post-colonialism can be understood. There are many ways to understand it, okay? It's a very broad term, but one way to understand it is that it's a theoretical and praxeological effort in the aftermath of colonization. So after acknowledging that it has already happened, to struggle with its residual effects and present forms to help bring about more justice and inclusivity, more respect for diversity. Okay, so we are now at our last part, and this is the shortest part. We will just look at some suggestions or something that we can do. So according to Jojo Fong, we need a radical reorientation of development. So it's not a negation or a rejection of development, but we need to reorient it, informed by companionship and the things we have talked about. So he says that it's important to have a conversion to a relational or Buddhist worldview, and I think that relates most to companionship as a new paradigm of looking at things. But it also picks up on the importance of the spirituality that is not dichotomous but embodied. Second, connecting cosmic spirituality and development through rituals. So sometimes when we pursue development, we just look at the different ways to analyze things, right? But the indigenous people, before they plant, they pray. When it's harvest time, they pray. Before they cut a tree, they know that they must respect it. And so they apologize or they thank the anitos who are there. So it's not just a matter of cost-benefit analysis or using different frameworks. I mean, those are important. We don't negate them, but the rituals, the spirituality involved in what we do is also important. And we mentioned that flourishing also talks about caring even for the spiritual or the transcendent. Pursuing an inclusive and sustainable economy. So the SGDs help a lot for that, right? So we don't just measure the GDP, but we also look at the standard of living, the different aspects that promote the well-being of human beings and the status, especially of the poor and the neglected. And resituating science and technology. So not rejecting it, but using it for the purposes of the first three bullet points. So in the Philippines, some practices that we could probably explore is, respecting and reasserting the rights of indigenous peoples. So not just to idealize them, but to see a post-colonial frame would ask that we recognize what we can appreciate, but we also see the violence that we continue to do against them. The second one is to advocate for the recognition of the rights of nature. It's currently a bill that is in our Congress, and rerouting ourselves in the communal, social, and ecological aspects of our spirituality. So I did just put Christianity there, but any kind of spirituality, including Christianity. Okay, so we do this out of reverence for created reality. We do this for intergenerational solidarity. Like we are all passing, and what kind of world are we leaving okay, for the next generation? With the hope that can somehow be expressed with this poem. So this is a poem by Judith Chicago. She's an American artist and writer, but the Federation of Asian Bishops Conference quoted her poem to speak of our to somehow describe the kind of hope that we have for our world. Okay, so the last question, and I guess we can also open the floor now for comments or questions. Is really up to you. I wanted to know, what do you think we can do, or what activities do you know of are in line with the companionship with the Earth theme or paradigm? So I've mentioned some efforts that can be done from the Philippines. I'm also curious to know about what you are doing from your part of the world. Okay, can you further explain the relation between anthropocentrism and gender? Okay, yes. Maybe to explain that, I will go back to this and then I'll go back to another slide. Here, Victoria Tauli Cruz mentions that they are victimized by dualism prevailing in Western religion and education. This dichotomization between spirit and nature, spirit and matter. Such dualism actually underpins the domination of man over woman, which is another way of describing androcentrism. The rich over the poor, technology over humanity, and so-called spiritual leaders over the common tao. And here we see anthropocentrism also at play. So it's the same logic. Maybe to make it clearer, so I showed you this before. Rosemary Radford Ruther traces different civilizations. Okay, and she says that we see dichotomies happening between for anthropocentrism and for androcentrism, right? So between culture and nature, and then it so happens that for men and women too, but these are false dichotomies. So for example, in some early civilizations, what happened, she says that what happened was men are usually the ones tasked with stuff that needs strength and a lot of energy. So they hunt, they go to war. Okay, but after that, they have more leisure time when it's not war time or hunting time. But the women, they do the ordinary domestic work, which they don't usually have time for leisure, which is seen as a more important, it shows that you can do important things. They are more into the mundane things that are related to livestock, to things pertaining to caring, nurturing, which is perceived as closer to nature. So even the construct of women being close to nature. Okay, so I won't expound so much on everything, but we can see a certain pattern, like sacred and profane or evil, and then who are the sacred holy men, and then the women, the witches, the those who are seen as inferior, who can be saved by being dutiful wives and submissive daughters, or submissive to authority. Okay, and then we also see the subject or the colonizer, and then the object or the colony. But we also, at the same time, there are many ways of describing colonization wherein it's the man who is the colonizer, and then women are literally conquered. Many colonized nations, they have their women who are domesticated, or violence is done against them. But also in literature, we see talk of virgin forest. We see the way the land is described. It's described in a very feminine way. So I hope that answers the question about the relation between anthropocentrism and gender. So I think we had to end at yeah. So right now, so thank you for being here and for your participation. I really enjoyed being with you virtually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanchez. And thank you also to everyone for your participation and for having us here in your class with Professor Biringer. Thank you to the Leuven and to the Ateneo de Manila University and the DLSU for this WISE project with the Global Minds. We thank the Global Minds for their support in this kind of project. Thank you so much to everyone. We hope that it has been a good interchange between the North and the South, indeed, for the well-being of everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Biringer. Dankjewel allemaal. Stay safe and have a very, very good lunch.
Oh yes, lunch. Wow.
Dankjewel, Professor Biringer.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Presence
Thank
of
you
the
very much,
here.
Dr. Sanchez. Thank you.
Thank you, Brie. Thank you, Lisa. We have two Lisas here. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Laura. Dankjewel, Matthias. Thank you, Noah. Good to see you back. Thank you, Kiri, Krobush, Shani, Teresa, and Thomas. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Thomas. Yeah. And for all those who have been here that we couldn't mention, but thanks so much for your presence. Thank you all. Yeah, we will send Professor Biringer the links and also the recording so that it can be posted in Toledo. Okay, so both the previous presentations as well as these presentations, they will be given to Professor Biringer for posting in Toledo, but also in the, we will give you a link to the Faculty of Theology Center for Women's Studies in Theology Facebook page, where you can also access the material. Dankjewel allemaal.
Yeah, last week's presentation is already posted in Toledo, so the students can already find it. And thank you very much for sending the recording.
Yeah, and perhaps Dr. Sanchez can also send a PDF of the PowerPoint for the easy review of the students. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sanchez. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you also.
Thank you. Very well done.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so do we end this? Who ends?
Yes, I will end the recording now. Okay, so thank you, everyone.